Hello, Americanist. I'm going to give you a lecture on the early Civil War. The first thing I want to do is I want to point out something for you to think about in terms of the larger historical narrative. We tend to think of the Civil War as the midpoint of our nation's history. It's about halfway between our nation's formation in 1776 and present day. But I want you to think about that as decades continue to pass, as you continue to grow older, the Civil War is going to become more distant in our nation's history. So it will not always be seen as being something halfway in our nation's history. So I just wanted to point that out. I also want to point out a couple of different phrases used to describe the Civil War. When we say Civil War, we hear that term, we automatically think of the American Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. But the actual term Civil War happens all the time. It's happening right now in Iraq. It has happened throughout world history. So some other ways to phrase the American Civil War is to call it the war between the states, and particularly in the South, especially right after the Civil War, sometimes it was referred to as the War of Northern Aggression. And then finally, it is also referred to sometimes as the Southern Insurrection, which of course bends towards the North as they saw it as a rebellion of the southern states. Either way, it officially takes place from 1861 after the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln and the fall of Fort Sumter, and it's going to end with the surrender of General Lee. So I'm going to read through a little bit of this summary and then I'm going to break it down for you. After the southern states seceded, and by that I mean the first 7 that seceded after Lincoln was elected but before he was inaugurated, the federal government sought to hold its forts on southern soil, i.e. Fort Sumter, and to keep border states from joining the Confederacy. Now, ultimately, Lincoln's going to be is going to be partly successful in his efforts. He's going to keep some border states from joining the Confederacy, like Kentucky, but he's going to lose other border states to the Confederacy, like Tennessee. The Union appeared to have formidable advantages at the outset of fighting, and the Confederate government needed to mobilize a unified effort contrary to its states' rights philosophy. A couple of comments about that last part. I want to go ahead and tell you that when you're thinking about the Civil War, you already understand a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of both sides because they match up very similarly to the advantages and disadvantages between the British and the colonists going into the American Revolution, with most of the advantages of the Union being the same as the British and most of the advantages of the South being similar to the colonists. The biggest difference, however, is the way that it turns out, because we know that in the American Revolution, the underdog, the colonists who were not expected to win, who had more disadvantages than advantages, they do win. And in the American Civil War, the Union, or the favored party, is going to be the one that wins the war. And we're going to talk a little bit more in just a second about why it happens that way. The last sentence is alluding to something else that I want to point out that's a bit ironic. The Confederacy was most angry about abuse and growth of federal power, and that had been going on since the Anti-Federalist movement and the Constitutional Convention. We had already seen flare-ups by southern states who felt like that the federal government was overreaching when we had the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in the Jeffersonian period, and also when we had the nullification crisis in the 1830s. But ironically, once the Confederacy withdraws from the United States and forms its own government, it realizes that in order to be a strong nation, and especially to win a war, you have to have a strong central government, and therefore they actually form a fairly strong central government. It wasn't like the 11 states that ended up forming the Confederacy were all fighting many wars against the Union. They had to unify. The 4-year military struggle brought drastic changes on the home fronts, including greatly increased power for the central government in the United States. The Union's naval blockade and success at minimizing foreign aid to the South were important factors in the outcome. The war to preserve the Union had also become a war to end slavery. Let me extrapolate a little bit on this summary. The first thing is when I mention the word home fronts here, what I'm talking about is that in the South, particularly where most of the Civil War was fought, the war itself was in everyone's backyard. It not only involved their family members, but schools became hospitals, farmland became battlefields, and so there were very few civilian areas, especially in Virginia and also in Atlanta and Savannah and Charleston, that were not touched by the Civil War beyond just the military itself. The middle part of that is, I alluded to a little bit earlier. The Union's naval blockade and success at minimizing foreign aid to the South were important factors in the outcome. When we think about the advantages and the disadvantages of the British and the colonists back in the American Revolution, if you'll remember, there were two important reasons why the colonists were able to win. Think about those in your head. Okay, let's check and see if you were right. The first major reason that the colonists were able to win was because the British people and the British government tired of the war. They didn't have the passion for it, and they were tired of sending troops over and losing troops and money in the war. They just gave up. The second major reason, though, and perhaps the biggest reason that the colonists won, is because they got the help of the French. What you probably don't know about the American Civil War, as much as people talk about it and talk around it, is that the South actively campaigned, the Confederacy actively campaigned for an alliance with the British. Had the South been able to secure an alliance with the British, the outcome could have been very, very different, much like the French helped the colonists turn the tide of the American Revolution. What ultimately fell through with the alliance, and it fell through in about 1862 and then was totally off the table by 1863, were a couple of things. One, the British had already outlawed slavery, and so they could not sympathize with them on the moral cause of slavery in any way. And secondly, they were waiting for the South to prove that they could win the war. And if you'll think again back to the American Revolution, you will remember that the French said the same thing. They said to the colonists and to George Washington, you have to prove that you can win this war, you have to win a major battle. And we did in the American Revolution, and that was called Saratoga. In the American Civil War, that major battle win never really happens. The biggest battle where the South really put it all on the line was at Gettysburg, and the South lost Gettysburg, and that was the final possibility, that was the final year and possibility that they had of entertaining a British alliance. So I want you to think about that and compare those two things in your head. All right, so the Civil War begins really by the time of Lincoln's inauguration. The key point to remember is that the new Lincoln administration faced the problems of 1, suppressing secession, 2, retaining the border states, and 3, protecting federal property in the South, like forts, with the example of Fort Sumter being the easiest to remember. By Lincoln's inauguration, and if you'll think about the map from our previous notes, 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, and the first to secede was South Carolina, who, don't forget, had threatened to secede during the nullification crisis with John C. Calhoun during Jackson's presidency. If you'll also think back, there's a major reason why the nullification crisis didn't go through, why South Carolina did not secede during that period. And if you'll remember, it's because no other southern states joined with South Carolina. And that's the big difference here. South Carolina threatens secession again, does secede, and this time it is joined by 6 additional states before Lincoln's inauguration, and then will be joined by an additional 4 states after Lincoln's inauguration in Fort Sumter. That's the big difference. Something interesting for you to think about is that we all know that Lincoln was assassinated at the very end of the Civil War. If you have not seen the movie Lincoln, I highly encourage you to do so. The movie stars our famous historical actor who seems to show up quite often in great historical movies, Daniel Day-Lewis. He plays Lincoln, and the movie does not focus on the battles. The movie focuses on Lincoln's efforts to get the 13th Amendment passed, which would settle the question of slavery once and for all. The 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolishes slavery and says you may not own a person. And he really wanted to do this before the Civil War ended, because when he brought the Confederate States back in, as he thought he would when the North eventually won, he didn't even want it to be a question. But the reason why the movie's so interesting, and it's a lot of dialogue, but it shows the very personal side of Lincoln, but also the dirty side of Lincoln. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Dirty politicians are usually the most effective ones. They are the ones that are willing to cut deals, they're willing to pay somebody off, they're willing to make promises, and Lincoln does just that to get the 13th Amendment passed. It is when he finally gets the 13th Amendment passed that he decides he's going to take a break and go out for an evening with his wife to the theater, and as we all know, that is where he is assassinated. Back to our point here in the PowerPoint, however, we all know Lincoln was assassinated, but I tend to think that Lincoln was pretty successful in serving as president as long as he did without being assassinated. Even before he was inaugurated, on a train ride from Springfield, Illinois to Baltimore, Maryland, he was hidden in disguise and rushed through all of the train stations because of fears of assassination. He was under constant threat of assassination. And while it was a Southerner, John Wilkes Booth, who ultimately did shoot Lincoln, there were many Northern threats against his life as well. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln emphasized that the Union was perpetual. And the word perpetual means it cannot be broken. It is always continuous. He once again made the same promise he had made in his campaign, that he would not interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. However, it was at that point that the South was no longer willing to accept that premise, because he had also promised that he would not extend it into new territories, and they knew that that meant it would eventually be repealed. At the same time, he also denied that the secession was legal. He refused to acknowledge that the Confederacy was a new nation. Don't forget, one of the biggest hurdles in nationhood is to be recognized by other nations as a nation. And number 3, he vowed to preserve the Union in the face of insurrection. In other words, he was not afraid to fight, and he was the first president really to make that pledge. So let's talk about the border states. We haven't said much about Delaware in a long time, but Delaware was actually a slave state, believe it or not. But it didn't have very many slaves. So Lincoln was not as concerned about Delaware. However, Maryland was a different story. Virginia, by the time of Fort Sumter, had seceded, and Lincoln is very fearful that Maryland could, which was also a slave state, would secede, and there was much talk of secession there. And if that had happened, then Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded by the Confederacy, and would have been much easier for the Confederacy to take Washington, D.C. So here's where we see Lincoln getting dirty when he needs to. Lincoln sent in federal troops, imposed martial military law, and helped to secure, i.e., made sure that the election was going to go pro-Union, and made sure that Maryland was going to stay a part of the Union, a part of the United States. Now, if you think about this today, even if a state is threatening something, or is making some kind of doing something wrong, it would be almost unheard of for the president to send in troops, impose U.S. military law, and essentially take over your government. But that's what Lincoln did. Missouri was also bitterly divided and became a battleground, particularly on the Arkansas border. Remember, Missouri was slave when it entered the Union, as Maine was entered free in 1820. And then finally, we have the situation with Kentucky, but I see I'm about to run out of time, so we'll pick back up right there.